The shadows of Stutthof, the camp, the wind off the Baltic Sea, did not carry the scent of salt, but of burning. Stutthof, hidden in the pine forests east of Danzig, was a place where humanity was dismantled. It was not just a prison, it was a machine of mud, typhus, and cruelty, where 85,000 souls perished under the watch of the SS. The women in uniform, they arrived not as monsters, but as ordinary young women nurses, tram conductors, housewives. But the SS uniform transformed them. In the hierarchy of suffering, the Aufseherin and female overseers found a sudden, intoxicating power. They held the whips, and the lives of thousands hung on their whims. The beautiful spectre Jenny Wanda Bachmann was the most striking of them all. Young, with sharp features and cold eyes, the prisoners whispered her nickname in terror, the beautiful spectre. She walked the camp with the grace of a predator, selecting victims for the gas chamber as if choosing produce at a market. The intelligent sadist Wanda Klaff, a former housewife, stood in contrast to Bachmann's icy calm. Klaff was volatile. "I am very intelligent," she would later tell the court, "and very devoted to my work." Her devotion manifested in daily beatings. She made it a rule to strike at least 2 prisoners every single day. The butcher Gerda Steinhoff was the butcher of Stutthof, a block leader in the women's camp. She didn't just supervise, she participated. She reveled in the selections, dragging women to the gas chambers with her own hands. For her loyalty, the Third Reich awarded her the Iron Cross, a medal now rusted with blood. Winter WWII Parodies was younger, perhaps more impressionable, but no less cruel. In the dead of the Polish winter, she forced female prisoners to strip naked in the snow. She doused them with buckets of ice water, watching them turn blue and collapse, freezing to death in minutes for her amusement. The selector Elizabeth Becker seemed unassuming, yet her role was godlike. She stood at the ramps in the barracks, her finger pointing left or right. To the left, forced labor and starvation. To the right, the gas chamber. Her finger sentenced hundreds of women and children to immediate death without a tremor of hesitation. The collapse, May 1945. The Red Army surged across the Vistula. The power of the SS crumbled overnight. The guards stripped off their uniforms, fleeing into the chaos of a broken Germany. They tried to blend in with the refugees, hiding their faces, hoping the world would forget the screams of Stutthof. The hunt they could not hide. The survivors remembered their faces. In train stations in ruined cities, former prisoners spotted their tormentors. Polish authorities, aided by vengeful survivors, rounded them up one by one. The hunters became the hunted, dragged from their hiding holes to face justice in Gdansk, that cage they were thrown into the very prisons they once filled. Now, stripped of their whips and boots, they looked small, but their arrogance remained. In their cells, they smoothed their hair and complained about the food, seemingly unable to comprehend that the power had shifted forever. Part 2. The Trial. The Courtroom, Gdansk, April 1946. The Special Criminal Court was packed. The air was thick with the smoke of cheap cigarettes and the sweat of a vengeful public. 13 defendants sat in the dock, 5 women, 8 men. The press cameras flashed, capturing their faces for history. The evidence survivors took the stand. They were gaunt, trembling, pointing shaking fingers at the women in the dock. They told of babies drowned in tubs, of old women beaten to death for walking too slow, of the constant, gnawing hunger. The court listened in horrified silence. Bachmann's defiance. Jenny Wanda Bachmann treated the trial like a social event. She changed her hairstyle daily, flirting with her guards, smiling for the cameras. She seemed to believe her beauty would save her. She listened to the testimonies of mass murder with a bored expression, checking her nails. Klaff's outburst. Wanda Klaff did not hide her nature. When asked about her brutality, she sneered. She admitted to the beatings openly, displaying a chilling lack of remorse. To her, the prisoners were subhuman. Disciplining them was simply her job, and she was proud of how well she did it. Steinhoff smiled. Gerda Steinhoff sat with a smirk plastered on her face. She joked with the other defendants, laughing as witnesses described her dragging women by the hair to the crematorium. Her complete detachment from the reality of her crimes chilled the judges more than any scream could. Their defense was flimsy. "We were just following orders. We were forced. I didn't do that." But the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. The survivors' scars were the map of their guilt. The prosecutors dismantled their lies with the weight of thousands of dead. The verdict, May 31, 1946. The gavel came down, guilty. For the women Bachmann, Steinhoff, Klaff, Becker, Parodies. The sentence was death. The courtroom erupted. The women's faces finally cracked. The arrogance slipped, replaced by the dawning realization of their mortality. Bachmann's last words upon hearing her death sentence. Jenny Wanda Bachmann stood. She looked at the judges, then at the press. With a cynicism that defined her life, she declared, "Life is indeed a pleasure, and pleasures are usually short." It was her final act of vanity. The appeal. They petitioned for clemency. They wrote letters to the Polish president, pleading for their lives, citing their youth, their gender, their ignorance. The president of Poland, Bolesław Bierut, reviewed the files. The sheer scale of sadism offered no room for mercy. All appeals were denied. The night before July 3, 1946, the final night in the GDO's prison, some prayed, others wept uncontrollably. Bachmann reportedly spent the night fixing her hair, ensuring she would look beautiful one last time. The reality of the dawn was approaching, bringing with it the rope. Part 3. The Procession. Morning rise, July 4, 1946. The sun rose over a city still rebuilding from rubble. In the prison, the women were awakened early. They were given a final meal, which most refused. They were allowed to dress in their civilian clothes, not prison stripes. They washed, prepped, and waited. The trucks outside the prison, a convoy of open-bed military trucks, idled. This would be their transport and their scaffold. The design was simple and brutal. They would stand on the truck beds, the nooses would be attached, and the trucks would drive away. Loading up, the women were led out in handcuffs. They were hoisted onto the back of the high trucks. They sat on wooden planks, their legs dangling or tucked under them. Armed soldiers stood guard. The engines roared to life, spewing exhaust into the summer air. The route the convoy moved through the streets of Stutthof. The city had turned out in force. People lined the sidewalks, hanging out of windows, climbing lampposts. There was no sympathy. They threw stones, spat at the trucks, and screamed curses at the women who had tormented their kin. Biskupia Gorka. The destination was Bishop's Hill, a high point overlooking the city, a natural amphitheater. The authorities had set up a row of T-shaped wooden gallows. 11 nooses swayed in the gentle breeze. The grass was green, the sky blue, a stark contrast to the death that was coming. The crowd, it was a sea of humanity. Estimates ranged from 50,000 to 200,000 spectators. They brought picnic baskets. They brought children. It was a carnival of vengeance. The atmosphere was electric, a collective release of the hatred built up over years of occupation and terror. Arrival, the trucks groaned up the hill and reversed into position under the gallows. The crowd surged forward, held back by a thin line of militia. The women on the trucks looked out at the ocean of hostile faces. For the first time, true terror was visible in their eyes. The arrangement, the trucks were lined up precisely. The women were made to stand on the flatbeds. They were positioned directly beneath the ropes. Their hands were tied behind their backs. Their feet were bound at the ankles to prevent them from kicking the executioners. The executioners, the hangmen, were not professionals. They were former prisoners of Stutthof, volunteers who had asked for the privilege. They wore striped concentration camp uniforms. It was a symbolic inversion of power. The victims were now the agents of justice. Bachmann on the bed, Jenny Wanda Bachmann, stood tall. She wore a smart coat and had her hair perfectly coiffed. She scanned the crowd with a look of disdain, refusing to show fear. Even at the end, she played the role of the untouchable queen of the camp. Part 4. The execution, the nooses. The executioners climbed onto the trucks. They placed the thick hemp ropes around the women's necks. The knots were heavy. They tightened them. Paradis was weeping. Klaff looked worried. Stutthof remained stony-faced. The rough rope scratched against their skin. The delay, there was a pause. The crowd grew quiet, a hush falling over the hill. The engines of the trucks idled loudly. The commanders checked the alignment. Everything had to be simultaneous. The tension stretched the seconds into hours. A priest, was present, offering final rites. Some of the women leaned in, whispering final confessions. Others stared straight ahead. It is unknown what God they prayed to after the hell they had created on earth. Stutthof struggled Gerda. Stutthof looked at the executioner, a man she might have once beaten. He looked back with eyes of stone. She adjusted her stance on the truck bed, trying to keep her balance as the vehicle vibrated. The reality of the physics of death was setting in. Paradis brakes, UA Paradis could not hold it together. She was sobbing, her shoulders shaking. The winter water guard who had frozen women to death was now trembling in the summer heat. She looked like a frightened child, stripped of the uniform that gave her cruelty its armor. The command, a shout rang out from the commanding officer. The drivers put the trucks into gear. The crowd inhaled collectively. The executioners on the trucks stepped off, leaving the women alone on the flatbeds. The trucks lurched forward. They didn't speed away. They rolled slowly, inexorably. The floor beneath the women's feet began to move. They shuffled, trying to stay on. But the ropes were taut. The drop, there was no trapdoor. As the trucks moved, the women were pulled off the back. They swung out into the empty air. It was a short drop, too short to break the neck instantly. This meant death by strangulation. The swing, the bodies jerked violently. The crowd roared a sound like thunder. The women kicked and thrashed, their bound feet dancing a macabre jig in the air. Their faces turned purple, then black. It was a brutal, ugly, prolonged end. Bachmann's end. Bachmann fought hard. Her body twisted on the rope. The beautiful spectre was reduced to a convulsing form. Her carefully styled hair fell over her face as she gasped for air that would not come. The myth of her invincibility died before her body did. One shoe, as Wanda Klaff swung, one of her shoes slipped from her foot and fell to the grass below. It lay there, a mundane object in a scene of horror. The crowd cheered even this small indignity. The struggle of Paradis, UA Paradis, was the last to stop moving, being light. Her struggle was longer. The rope strangled her slowly. The crowd watched every twitch, every spasm, measuring her suffering against the suffering she had inflicted. The silence slowly, the thrashing ceased. One by one, the bodies went limp. They twisted slowly in the wind, rotating to face the city, then the hill, then the city again. The roar of the crowd subsided into a low murmur. Justice had been done. The inspection doctor moved down the line. He checked for pulses. He nodded at each body. Dead, dead, dead. The women of Stutthof were gone. The reign of terror was officially over. The children in the crowd. Children sat on their father's shoulders to get a better view. They stared at the hanging women with wide eyes. This was the world they inherited, a world where monsters were real, and where monsters were killed on sunny afternoons. Photographers swarmed the gallows. They took close-ups of the swollen faces, the rope burns, the limp hands. These photos would be printed in newspapers across Poland and the world, a graphic warning to any who would dream of fascism again. Looting the dead. Rumors swirled that in the chaos after the execution, the crowd might try to tear at the clothing of the condemned for souvenirs. The militia held the line tight. The bodies were sacred in their damnation, not to be touched by the mob. Leaving the hill, the crowd began to disperse. They walked back down the hill toward Jadovsk. There was a sense of lightness, a burden lifted. The monsters were dead. They could go home to their dinners and their rebuilding. Unmarked graves. The bodies were cut down later that evening. They were not given funerals. They were transported to the Anatomical Institute for use in medical studies, or buried in unmarked graves. They were denied the dignity of a memorial. They were to be erased. The memory, the gallows were dismantled, but the photos remained. The images of Bachmann, Steinhoff, and the others hanging in a row became iconic symbols of the post-war reckoning. Biskupia. Gorka went quiet again, the grass growing over the spot where the women of Stutthof danced their final deadly step.